7 billion people alive today, and for centuries, 13 families made the decisions that shaped what those billions would eat, believe, fight over, and die for. Not elected, not celebrated, quietly, through banks and bloodlines, through marriages and mercenaries, through the slow, invisible machinery of compounding power. Today we go inside that machinery. We'll walk through the counting houses of medieval Florence, where a single family held the keys to every European throne. We'll track the dynasty that turned a single cargo ship into a global empire stretching across 4 continents. And finally, the family that funded both sides of a world war and then wrote the peace treaty that started the next one. You think history was made by kings? Kings were the product. Deep breath. Let's go. 13. Call them the architects of holy silence. The Orsini family of Rome, one of the oldest noble houses in recorded European history, began accumulating power sometime around the 10th century and did not stop for 600 years. 600 years. To understand that span, consider. The United States has existed for roughly 2.5 centuries. The Orsini were already entrenched in Roman politics before Columbus was born, and their influence stretched well past his death. But the strangest thing about the Orsini isn't their longevity. We'll come back to that. They held the peculiar distinction of producing 5 popes. 5. In an era when the papacy controlled land, armies, excommunications, and the right to determine which royal marriages were legitimate, 5 popes inside one bloodline meant an almost unbreakable feedback loop of divine authority and earthly real estate. Each pope installed cardinals. Cardinals elected future popes. The Orsini understood institutional capture 800 years before that phrase existed. Their estates spanned central Italy. Their fortresses studded the Roman countryside like teeth. Rival families, including the Colonna, another legendary Roman dynasty, spent generations in open warfare with the Orsini, and neither side won decisively. The conflict was so persistent, it became a structural feature of Roman politics, not an interruption to it. And now, about that strangest thing. The Orsini didn't decline through defeat. They simply married outward until their bloodline was absorbed into so many European noble houses that tracking any single Orsini became impossible. Researchers studying European aristocratic genealogy estimate that a significant portion of modern European royal and noble lineages carry Orsini ancestry. They didn't fall, they dissolved into everything around them. Some bloodlines end. The Orsini became the water. And if they were just the beginning of this list, understand that what follows gets considerably harder to explain away. 12. The Borghese, the dynasty that made the Vatican its personal gallery. The Borghese family arrived in Rome from Siena in the 16th century, and within 2 generations had placed one of their own on the throne of St. Peter, Camillo Borghese, who became Pope Paul V in 1605. That papacy lasted 16 years. 16 years of redirecting the most powerful institution in Christendom toward Borghese interests. The mechanics were not subtle. The Pope's nephew, Cardinal Scipione Borghese, was handed control of the papal treasury and used it with extraordinary efficiency. He commissioned the Villa Borghese, today one of the finest private art collections ever assembled, filling it with Berninis, Caravaggios, and Raphaels. Some of those works were acquired through purchases. Others, according to historical records, were acquired through confiscation when artists or collectors fell out of political favor. When a painter refused to sell his work to Scipione, the painter was arrested on a fabricated charge. The work was then transferred to the Borghese collection. But here's the detail that the tourist brochures skip. The Borghese wealth didn't stay locked in stone villas. Through strategic marriages across 2 centuries, Borghese capital and titles moved into the Aldobrandini family, into the Pamphili line, and, critically, into the Bonaparte family. In 1803, Camillo Borghese married Pauline Bonaparte, Napoleon's sister. The Borghese effectively fused their ancient Roman authority with the most powerful military force in early 19th century Europe. 2 brands of power, cross-pollinating. The Villa Borghese and its contents are now public museum property. The family's physical empire was ultimately liquidated, but their network, the marriages, the bloodlines, the institutional connections they seeded across centuries, those have no deaccession date. Some families collect art. The Borghese collected influence, and the art was just the receipt. 11 families still to go. The next one didn't build churches, they built the machine that paid for them. 11. The Fuggers. Call them the bank that wore a crown. The Fugger dynasty of Augsburg, Germany, rose from modest textile traders in the 14th century to become the dominant financial power in Europe by the early 16th. And the story of how they did it is simultaneously the story of how the modern concept of sovereign debt was invented. Jacob Fugger, known in his own time as Jacob the Rich, was not a subtle man about his wealth. When Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I once attempted to dismiss a debt reminder by citing his imperial dignity, Fugger produced the original loan documents and explained, calmly, that the empire existed in its current form partly because the Fugger Bank had funded the military campaigns that held it together. The emperor paid. The numbers are worth translating. At his death in 1525, Jacob Fugger controlled assets estimated, accounting for inflation and economic scaling, at the equivalent of somewhere between 300 and 400 billion US dollars in modern purchasing power. That figure, cited by economic historians including Greg Steinmetz in his biography of Fugger, would make him the wealthiest individual in recorded history. Wealthier than any figure on any contemporary rich list. Wealthier than the GDP of most modern nations. But the mechanism is what matters. The Fuggers didn't just lend money, they lent money in exchange for monopoly rights. They financed the election of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, directly funding the bribes paid to the 7 electoral princes, and in return received exclusive rights to Central European silver and copper mines, the mercury trade in Spain, and tax collection rights across entire provinces. They turned a loan into a continent-scale extraction machine. Imagine standing in the Fuggerei, the social housing project Jacob built for the poor of Augsburg in 1516, the oldest continuously occupied social housing complex in the world. Residents today pay an annual rent of 88 euro cents, not 88 euros, 88 cents. The requirement in exchange: pray 3 times daily for the soul of the Fugger family. That arrangement has been running without interruption for over 500 years. You can live there. The prayer is still required. The Fugger line eventually declined through overextension and inheritance fragmentation, but the template they created, sovereign debt as leverage for private extraction rights, became the operating system of every major bank that came after them. First, you fund the king. Then the king works for you. The dynasty that comes next understood that principle before the Fuggers were even born. 10. The Medici. Call them the godfathers of the modern world. There is almost no corner of Western civilization that cannot be traced, directly or indirectly, to a decision made by a member of this Florentine family between 1397 and 1737. Banking, art, political philosophy, church reform, the very concept of credit as a commercial instrument. The Medici didn't shape one industry. They built the scaffolding everything else was mounted on. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici founded the Medici Bank in Florence in 1397. Within 2 generations, that bank had branches in 16 cities across Europe. But the real innovation wasn't geography, it was the letter of credit. Before the Medici systematized it, merchants physically transported gold and silver across bandit-filled roads. The Medici allowed a merchant in London to deposit funds there, receive a letter, travel to Florence, and withdraw the equivalent. They invented the infrastructure of financial abstraction. The profits from that infrastructure funded something unprecedented, the systematic patronage of art and intellectual life on an industrial scale. Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Donatello, all worked under Medici patronage at some point. This was not charity. The Medici understood that prestige was a currency, that surrounding themselves with genius made their political authority look like destiny rather than accumulation. 3 Medici became popes, 2 became queens of France. When Catherine de' Medici married the future Henry II of France in 1533, she brought with her something that changed European civilization as much as any treaty: the fork. French court cuisine before Catherine's arrival was eaten with hands or knives. She introduced the fork from Italian custom. Within a generation, it was standard across the continent. A banking dynasty from Florence rewrote how Europe ate its dinner. And here is the detail that doesn't fit the narrative. The Medici Bank collapsed in 1494. Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent, the great patron, had diverted depositor funds into political patronage and personal projects. The bank failed. Florence expelled the family. By every conventional measure, the dynasty should have ended there. It didn't. The Medici returned. They retook Florence. They produced 2 more popes and 2 French queens across the following century. They survived their own bankruptcy. Try naming another family that did that and still shaped the world for 200 more years after the collapse. Their last direct heir died in 1737. The name died. The architecture, the paintings, the financial systems, the forks. Those are still in your life right now. Next on this list is a dynasty that didn't work through culture. They worked through cargo. 9. The Sassoon family. Call them the merchant kings of the East. While European dynasties were playing chess with church and crown, the Sassoon family built a commercial empire that stretched from Baghdad to Bombay to Shanghai, controlling trade routes that moved goods across 3 continents for over a century, and doing it with a level of operational secrecy that made most of their European contemporaries look transparent by comparison. David Sassoon, born in Baghdad in 1792, into a family of prominent Jewish merchants, relocated to Bombay in 1832 after political conditions in Iraq became dangerous. Within a decade, he had established a trading house with agents in Calcutta, Canton, Hong Kong, and Yokohama. The Sassoon network functioned as a kind of private postal and financial system for Asian commerce, using family members in each city, communicating in Judeo-Arabic to prevent interception, moving money and goods with a speed and security that no institution in the region could match. The controversial chapter of Sassoon history centers on the opium trade. In the mid-19th century, the Sassoon firm was among the largest traders in legal opium, moving from India into China. A trade that, according to historian Joseph Sassoon, in his 2022 study of the family, generated enormous profits and was, at the time, entirely legal under British colonial law. The trade produced addiction and social devastation in China on a massive scale. It also produced the capital base that funded the Sassoon transformation into one of the most prominent families in British high society. By the late 19th century, Albert Sassoon had been made a baronet. The family owned estates across England, were close associates of the Prince of Wales, and wielded social influence that few industrial-era families could match. Siegfried Sassoon, the First World War poet whose raw and furious anti-war verse remains some of the most powerful in the English language, was a member of this family. The family that built wealth through Asian trade produced the man who most eloquently mourned the waste of a European war. The Sassoon commercial empire eventually dispersed through the 20th century, diluted by war, nationalism, and the collapse of colonial trade structures. But the network model they pioneered, family members in each node of a global supply chain, internal communication in a language outsiders couldn't read, is recognizable in every multinational logistics operation today. The package that arrives at your door has ancestors. Some of them spoke Judeo-Arabic in a counting house in Bombay. The family that comes next didn't trade goods across continents. They traded the continents themselves. 8. The House of Nassau. Call them the architects of the modern state. Most people encounter Nassau as the name on a Bahamian beach or a German city. Few connect it to the dynasty that essentially invented the template of the modern constitutional nation, and fewer still realize that dynasty's influence stretches in an unbroken line from a medieval German county to the current Dutch royal family and the British crown. The House of Nassau emerged in the 12th century in what is now central Germany. Their trajectory changed permanently when William I of Orange, William the Silent, led the Dutch revolt against Spanish Habsburg rule, beginning in 1568. That revolt, known as the 80 Years' War, produced the Dutch Republic, the first major European state organized around merchant interests and religious tolerance, rather than monarchical absolutism or church authority. The Dutch Republic became the model that American and French revolutionaries studied 2 centuries later. William was called the Silent, not because he was quiet, but because he was famously good at keeping secrets. According to historical records, when the Spanish king put a price on his head, the first modern political assassination contract of its kind, some historians argue, William continued operating his networks for years before eventually being shot in his own home in 1584. But here is the thread that most history books cut off too early. The Nassau-Orange Line didn't end with Dutch independence. William III of Orange invaded England in 1688 in what is called the Glorious Revolution, an event that ended absolute monarchy in Britain, established parliamentary supremacy, and directly produced the constitutional settlement that the American founders later used as their reference model. William III co-ruled Britain with his wife Mary II. The Bill of Rights passed under their reign. The Bank of England was founded in 1694, partly through their sponsorship. A single dynastic line, across a century and a half, produced Dutch independence, the first modern republic, the British constitutional settlement, the Bank of England, and the intellectual framework for the American Constitution. No other family has a comparable list. Their descendants today wear crowns in the Netherlands. The institutions they built govern billions of people who have never heard the name Nassau. What comes next is a dynasty that didn't build institutions. They married into them, every single one. 7. The Habsburgs. Call them the dynasty that swallowed Europe. There is a Latin phrase, bella gerant alii, to Felix Austria nube, usually translated as, let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. It was written about the Habsburgs, and it is possibly the most accurate geopolitical summary of any family in history. At their peak in the 16th century, the Habsburgs held the thrones of the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, and the vast territories of the Americas through Spanish colonial claim. One family, simultaneously governing what was then the largest empire in human history. The mechanism was marriage, relentlessly and systematically deployed. The dynasty famously developed a pronounced lower jaw, the Habsburg jaw, documented in a 2019 scientific study published in the Annals of Internal Medicine, as a direct result of generations of cousin marriages designed to keep titles and territories within the family. The study analyzed 66 portraits of 11 generations of Habsburgs and found a clear correlation between inbreeding coefficient and jaw deformity. The price of continental dominance was written into their bones. Charles II of Spain, the last Spanish Habsburg, was so severely affected by the accumulated genetic consequences of dynastic intermarriage that he could not chew his own food. He died in 1700 without an heir, at 38. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, which redrew the map of Europe and lasted 13 years. A single family's biological collapse started a continent-wide conflict. But the Habsburg influence did not end in 1700. The Austrian branch continued until 1918, governing the vast and complicated Austro-Hungarian Empire, a multi-ethnic, multilingual patchwork of 11 major nationalities that functioned as the Central European power bloc for centuries. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot in Sarajevo in 1914, he was a Habsburg. The chain of events that followed cost 17 million lives. One family, one bloodline, one bullet, and the world changed for 100 years. You've heard the stories about what came before that bullet. The dynasty that comes next made sure you would never understand what came after. 6. The Rockefellers. Call them the architects of American power. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870. By 1882, in 12 years, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of all oil refining capacity in the United States. Not a dominant market position, 90%. The closest modern analogy would be a single company controlling 90% of all internet traffic, all smartphone manufacturing, and all cloud computing simultaneously. The mechanism was not simply efficiency. Rockefeller negotiated secret rebate agreements with the railroads, the only way to move oil at scale, that gave Standard Oil preferential shipping rates unavailable to competitors. When competitors were crushed or bought out, the railroad rebates were expanded. The feedback loop ran until the Supreme Court ordered the dissolution of Standard Oil in 1911. That dissolution produced 34 successor companies, among them ExxonMobil, Chevron, Amoco, Arco, and others. Rockefeller personally held shares in all of them. His fortune, already the largest in American history at the time of dissolution, grew after the breakup because the individual companies were worth more separately than the monopoly had been valued in aggregate. The government's antitrust remedy made him richer. At his peak, Rockefeller's personal fortune represented approximately 1.5% of the entire US GDP. In 2024 dollars, that figure translates to roughly $400 billion. But translate it differently. If you had taken every dollar earned by every American worker in a given year, 1.5 cents of every dollar belonged to one man. The family's second chapter was deliberate and consequential. The Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913, funded the transformation of American medical education. The Flexner Report of 1910, which the foundation supported, reorganized medical schools across North America and established the research-based model of medicine that remains standard today. They funded public health infrastructure, agricultural research, and university endowments across decades. Whether this represents genuine philanthropy or the strategic legitimization of dynastic wealth, that debate has not been resolved. What is documented? The Rockefeller family's influence on American energy, medicine, education, and political life extended continuously from 1870 through the late 20th century. 4 generations of strategic institutional investment, using oil money to purchase authority in every sector that oil money couldn't directly buy. Your doctor trained in a system the Rockefellers designed. Your car runs on a market the Rockefellers built. The road between those two facts is not an accident. The family coming next understood markets too, but they weren't interested in one country's market. They wanted all of them. 5. The Rothschilds. Call them the house that funded history. There is perhaps no family in modern history more mythologized and more deliberately misrepresented than the Rothschilds. They have been the subject of conspiracy theories ranging from the mundane to the grotesque, and those theories have been used for over 2 centuries by actors with explicitly anti-Semitic agendas. That distortion is worth naming clearly, because the actual documented history of the Rothschild family is remarkable enough without fabrication. Meyer Amschel Rothschild, born in the Frankfurt Judengasse, the Jewish ghetto, in 1744, built his initial fortune through coin dealing and currency exchange under the patronage of the Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel. His real innovation was organizational. He sent each of his 5 sons to a different European financial capital, Frankfurt, Vienna, London, Naples, Paris, and established them as coordinated but legally separate banking operations. Information about currency movements, political developments, and market conditions flowed across the network faster than it could travel by any other means available in the early 19th century. The Waterloo legend is worth addressing directly because it has been so thoroughly distorted. The story, that a Rothschild agent witnessed Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in 1815, rode ahead of official couriers to London, and used the information to profit massively in government bonds, appears in various forms. What is historically documented, according to financial historian Niall Ferguson, in his 2-volume study of the family, is that Nathan Rothschild in London did receive early information about the outcome, and did trade in the bond market around that period. The precise profits, the exact sequence, and the theatrical details are disputed or embellished. What is clear? The Rothschild network's information advantage was real, structural, and consistently exploited. By the mid-19th century, the Rothschild Bank had financed the British government's purchase of the Suez Canal in 1875, the Cecil Rhodes mining operations in South Africa, railroad construction across Europe and the Americas, and the loans that allowed several governments to finance wars they could not otherwise have fought. They were simultaneously creditors to multiple governments that were, at various points, at war with each other. Here is the detail that the conspiracy theories always miss, because it's more interesting than the myths. The Rothschild family lost enormous assets and family members in the Holocaust. The Vienna and Frankfurt branches were effectively destroyed by the Nazi regime, properties seized, wealth confiscated. The family that conspiracy theorists cast as pulling the strings of European governments could not prevent European governments from destroying them. History is not always tidy about its ironies. The London and Paris branches survived and remain active today. The family's influence is real, documented, and diminished from its 19th century peak. The mythology around them tells you more about the people who need a hidden hand to explain history than it does about any family. Real power rarely needs to hide. it just needs to be patient. The dynasty coming next was patient for so long, they outlasted the very concept of dynasties. 4. The Saud family.
They were patient for so long.
Call them the owners of the ground beneath history. In 1902, Abdulaziz ibn Saud, aged approximately 21, led a raiding party of 40 men into the city of Riyadh and captured it from a rival clan. From that raid, conducted largely through surprise and personal daring, he built by 1932 what is now the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The territory he unified sits atop the Ghawar oil field, the single largest conventional oil field ever discovered, stretching approximately 280 kilometers in length. That is longer than the distance from London to Paris. The financial implications did not fully emerge until Standard Oil of California struck oil at commercial quantities in 1938. What followed was one of the most consequential commercial relationships in modern history. The United States received preferential access to Saudi petroleum. In exchange, the House of Saud received American military protection, weapons, and political legitimacy. That arrangement, oil for security, across 9 decades, has shaped every major geopolitical decision in the Middle East since the Second World War. The numbers are difficult to translate into human scale. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's Sovereign Wealth Fund, the Public Investment Fund, currently holds assets of approximately $700 billion. The Saudi Aramco Company, partially privatized but majority state-owned, which means majority Saud family adjacent, is the most profitable company in the history of publicly traded corporations. In 2022, it reported annual profits of $161 billion. Not revenue, profit. But the most remarkable fact about the House of Saud is not the wealth, it is the number. Current estimates place the number of princes within the House of Saud, males of the royal bloodline holding some form of royal title, at between 7,000 and 15,000 individuals. The range itself tells you something. No external body knows the exact figure. The family is so large it has become an institution, a bureaucracy, a government within a government. Every time you fill a tank with gasoline anywhere in the industrialized world, a fraction of that transaction flows through systems the House of Saud built or controls. The ground beneath your car was their decision to sell. The price was their negotiation. You had no seat at that table. No one did except them. The family coming next didn't control what was under the ground. They controlled what moved through the air. 3. Before we reach the final 2 families on this list, pause for a moment, because what comes next are not dynasties of wealth or territory. They are dynasties of systemic control. Families who understood, before almost anyone else, that the most durable power is the power that is invisible to the people it governs. What follows is darker, more complex, and more difficult to dismiss. The Li family of Hong Kong. Call them the invisible hand of Asian capital. Li Ka-shing was born in 1928 in Chaozhou, China, into a family of modest means. His father died of tuberculosis when Ka-shing was 15. He left school to support his family, working in a plastics factory. By 22, he owned it. By 30, he had pivoted into real estate. What followed is one of the most sustained records of capital accumulation in the 20th and 21st centuries. But the Li family story is not simply a rags to riches trajectory. It is a study in how a single family positioned itself as structurally indispensable to an entire region's economy during one of the most volatile periods of political transition in modern history, the handover of Hong Kong from British to Chinese sovereignty. At the peak of his business empire, Li Ka-shing's companies, operating under the conglomerate umbrellas of C.K. Hutchison Holdings and C.K. Asset Holdings, controlled significant shares of Hong Kong's retail market through the Watson's Health and Beauty chain, port operations in over 50 countries, including the Hutchison Ports network at both ends of the Panama Canal, telecommunications networks across Europe and Asia, and real estate holdings spanning multiple continents. The Panama Canal detail is worth pausing on. One family from Hong Kong holds operating concessions at Balboa and Cristobal, the Pacific and Atlantic entrances to the canal, through which approximately 5% of global trade passes annually. Not the whole canal, the 2 ends. A private company controlled by one family manages the entry points of a waterway that moves roughly 270 million tons of cargo per year. Here is the information hook that historians of the region return to repeatedly. Li Ka-shing's business relationships navigated both British colonial authority and the Chinese Communist Party with such consistent success across 60 years that some analysts describe his position as structurally untouchable, indispensable to both systems simultaneously. The mechanism of that navigation, the exact nature of the relationships with Beijing, the terms of specific arrangements, those details are not in the public record. What is in the public record? In 2025, under circumstances that drew significant geopolitical attention, Li Ka-shing's family agreed to sell a significant portion of its port operations, including the Panama Canal concessions, to BlackRock-led investors.
The Panama Canal, now under
After the U.S. government expressed concerns about Chinese influence over the canal's endpoints, the sale was subsequently blocked or complicated by Chinese government intervention. One family, positioned between Washington, Beijing, and London simultaneously for 6 decades. The pattern doesn't have a public explanation, but the pattern is there. The second family on this list built their power even further from any map any government could draw. 2. The House of Windsor. Call them the survivors of history's longest audit. In 1917, the British royal family changed its name. They had been the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a German name, deeply inconvenient during a world war fought against Germany. King George V issued a proclamation renaming the house Windsor after the castle. It was, historians note, one of the most effective rebranding operations in political history. A name change on official paper, and suddenly the most German royal family in Europe became quintessentially English. That survival instinct, the ability to adapt surface presentation while preserving structural power, is the defining characteristic of the Windsor dynasty, and the reason it belongs near the top of any list about dynastic persistence. The Crown Estate, which is technically the property of the monarch as a corporate entity rather than personal property, holds assets currently valued at approximately £15.5 billion. The income from Crown Estate holdings goes to the British Treasury, which then returns a percentage to the royal family as the sovereign grant. This arrangement, restructured in 2012, means the family's public funding is tied to the commercial success of the estates they technically own. The more the Crown Estate earns, the more the family receives, currently approximately £86 million annually. But the formal finances are almost beside the point. The Crown's constitutional function, the ability to dissolve Parliament, to grant royal assent, to appoint prime ministers through the reserve powers, to act as head of state for 15 Commonwealth realms simultaneously, represents a form of structural authority that no elected official in any of those 15 countries possesses. In Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and 12 other nations, the head of state is not elected. They inherited the position. And here is the detail that most coverage skips. The Windsor family has never been required to disclose the full extent of its private wealth. The monarch's private estate, separate from the Crown Estate, is legally exempt from inheritance tax. The Duchy of Lancaster, worth approximately £650 million and generating approximately £24 million annually, passes intact to each new monarch. Comprehensive independent audit of total royal wealth has never occurred. You live in a democracy. Its head of state answers to no election. Think about what it means to hold a position that cannot be voted away. In a system built on the principle that power must answer to the people, the Windsors have held that position, in one form or another, since 1917. Their predecessors held it in an unbroken line stretching to the Norman conquest of 1066. Roughly 1,000 years. Still there, still unaudited. Everything before this list was prologue. First place is the family that didn't just survive history. They financed the conditions that made the history possible. 1. The Medici, the Rothschilds, the Fuggers. They all operated within existing systems. The dynasty at the top of this list built the system they then operated within. The Barings. Call them the sixth great power. In 1802, the French statesman Talleyrand made an observation about the financial order of the world. He named 5 great powers: England, France, Russia, Austria, Prussia. Then he added a 6th, Baring Brothers, a private bank, a single family's counting house. listed alongside the empires that controlled the armies of the 19th century. The Baring Brothers Bank was founded in 1762 by Francis Baring, the son of a German immigrant wool merchant who had come to London and built a modest trading business. Francis had a talent for sovereign debt that bordered on strategic genius. He understood something that governments themselves were slow to grasp. The entity that finances a war controls the war, because without money, armies stop. The Louisiana Purchase, the 1803 transaction by which the United States doubled its territory, acquiring 828,000 square miles of land from Napoleon for approximately $15 million, was financed by Baring Brothers in coordination with the Dutch bank Hope and Company. The United States government did not have $15 million in accessible capital. The Barings raised it, issued bonds, and transferred the funds. The physical transaction of the largest land purchase in American history passed through one family's bank. Translate the geography. Every state west of the Mississippi, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, most of Louisiana, and portions of 14 additional states, exists in its current form partly because a British banking family decided the loan was creditworthy. The Barings also financed the British government during the Napoleonic Wars. They financed the Russian government during its infrastructure expansion. They arranged the loans that funded major South American independence movements. At their peak in the mid-19th century, Baring Brothers had relationships with the government debt of every major nation on Earth simultaneously. Not all of them, every major one. But the strangest thing about the Baring family isn't the Louisiana Purchase or the Napoleonic loans. We'll come back to that. The mechanism of their power was information, specifically the asymmetric access to government fiscal information that their banking relationships generated. When you are the lender to 12 governments simultaneously, you learn, before any market can price the information, when a government is about to default, when a military campaign has run out of funds, when a peace treaty is being negotiated. That information, in the hands of a sophisticated financial operator, is worth more than the interest on any loan. They understood this. They used it. In 1890, the Baring Bank came within hours of collapse. Overextension in Argentina, loans advanced during a speculative boom that turned suddenly to bust, left them unable to meet obligations. The Bank of England, working with the British Treasury and other major banks, organized a rescue. The British financial system collectively bailed out the Barings because the alternative, the simultaneous collapse of sovereign debt relationships across multiple continents, was considered too dangerous to allow. A private family bank received a government rescue because it was considered structurally too important to fail. In 1890, this was not 2008. This was the Victorian era. The concept of a bank being too important to let fail was, for most of the world, still being invented. The Barings had already reached that status, and now, about that strangest thing. In 1995, a 28-year-old derivatives trader named Nick Leeson, operating out of the Barings Bank's Singapore office, accumulated losses of approximately £827 million through unauthorized speculative positions. The bank had failed to implement any meaningful oversight of his positions for years, despite internal signals that something was wrong. When the losses were finally declared, Baring Brothers, the sixth great power, the bank that financed the Louisiana Purchase, the lender to empires, collapsed in 48 hours. It was sold to a Dutch bank, ING, for £1. £1. The bank that built the modern financial world, acquired for the price of a cheap sandwich. There is no official single explanation for why the internal controls failed so completely for so long. The most credible theory among financial historians is organizational. The bank had survived for 233 years on the trust generated by the Baring name and family relationships, and that trust had been substituted over generations for the oversight mechanisms that any institution of that size required. The name was so powerful that scrutiny of what was done under the name became almost unthinkable internally. The family's social and philanthropic legacy in Britain remains significant. The Baring Foundation operates today. Baring Asset Management, a separate entity, continues in global finance. The bloodline persists, but the bank is gone. 233 years of building a system, 48 hours to lose it. That is what dynastic power looks like at its most honest. Immovable until it isn't. Eternal until one morning it simply isn't there. No army, no revolution, just a number on a spreadsheet in Singapore that no one had been allowed to question, because the name on the building made questioning feel unnecessary. The name outlasted the institution. The institution outlasted the empire. The empire outlasted the century that built it, quietly, invisibly, and then all at once. 13 families, 6 centuries, every corner of the world's map touched, bent, or redrawn by bloodlines and ledgers, and the patient accumulation of what cannot be voted away. Here is the thought that ties them together. Every single family on this list understood something that most people never learn. Visible power is already weakened. The moment a king announces authority, he is already negotiating it. The families that shaped centuries were the ones who let the kings make the announcements while the ledgers ran the mathematics. History is not made by the names that appear in the speeches. It is made by the names that appear in the contracts. Now here's the question that I want you to sit with. If you could spend one day inside the archive of one of these families, the unredacted version, the letters no one has published, the accounts no audit has ever touched, which would you choose? The Rothschilds, whose information network won and lost more than most armies? Or the Barings, whose bank was called a great power and sold for £1? If this list made you look at the world slightly differently than you did 35 minutes ago, that's what the like button is for. Not because you enjoyed it, because something clicked, because you'll think about contracts and ledgers the next time you hear a speech. Stay safe and see you soon.